rowdy, wishing me heart it was Sunday. Drinking wine and beer all the week, time for whiskey on a Sunday.
Good evening, everyone. You are all very welcome here tonight for episode 3 of my new online series, Whiskey on a Sunday. Now, for those of you that are joining for the first time, either live here on Instagram, or if you're watching via video replay, each week at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I will be mostly live to chat with an adult audience about some whiskey history, about what's new in the world of whiskey, and also to do a live tasting of 1, 2, or in tonight's case, 3 whiskey products. More importantly, at least in my opinion, I'm also going to tell the story of what's behind what's in my glass. Again, folks, as this series is indeed intended for an adult audience, please, if you are not legally able to purchase and enjoy whiskey or alcohol, for that matter, where you live, if you cannot purchase and enjoy it legally where you live, then you need to sign off now. Alrighty, for all the adults. In episode 1, I talked about the 2 spellings of the word whiskey. Whiskey being W-H-I-S-K-Y and whiskey being spelled W-H-I-S-K-E-Y. I mentioned that legally there's no rules that apply here. Either spelling, is globally accepted and recognized. Although traditionally, or more traditionally, Irish whiskeys tend to use the K-E-Y ending in the spelling of whiskey. This can have some significant marketing influence though. And the reason I bring this up is that earlier this week I came across an article where Diageo, who is a large alcohol owner of different properties and brands throughout the world. Diageo recently had to completely scrap and throw out a holiday marketing campaign for Old Highland Park Scottish whiskey. Seems that someone, in putting the ad piece together, chose to spell whiskey W-H-I-S-K-E-Y. And truthfully, the Scottish just would not have any of that. No way, no how. The whole thing had to be scrapped. Not going to do it. Scottish said, nope, period. For them, for the Scots, whiskey spelt W-H-I-S-K-E-Y is Irish. I mean, again, globally and legally, that's not the case, but for them, nope. And I found it a little bit funny, and I found it a little apropos, considering we were just talking about that a little while ago. So, shows you the importance that spelling can have on marketing. Okay, so let's dive into tonight's episode, where we have 3 whiskeys that we're going to talk about. But before we get to them, we're going to talk about the decline of Irish whiskey. Now, I have said over the last 2 weeks that Irish whiskey, was doing very well on the global level in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I think the cat may join us, folks, so, live television here. So I said that the Irish whiskey was, king of the world, essentially, in the 19th and early 20th century. And that's true. In the 1800s, Irish distillers were indeed kings. There was a high point that came in 1893 at the Chicago World Trade Fair, which saw a 30-foot round tower constructed entirely of Powers Irish whiskey bottles. And it proved to be a complete showstopper for all the attendees. So they're on top of the world, they've got these show-stopping things, everyone's loving Irish whiskey. What happened? Well, some would argue that the foundation for the decline of Irish whiskey's popularity and the Irish whiskey industry was laid way back in 1846 with the repeal of the UK Importation Act. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, prior to this Importation Act being repealed, it was illegal to import any non-UK grown grain into the United Kingdom. In a small effort to address what a lot of us know as An Gorta Mór, Ireland's Great Hunger, that began with the failed potato crops in 1845 and subsequently lasted until 1852. In a move to try and address that to a small degree, the UK had the idea that repealing the ban on importing non-UK grain in, may provide some relief for the Irish famine. So they went ahead and they did this. In reality, though, repealing this act did very little to help the Irish hunger, as the Scottish whiskey industry took huge advantage of this opportunity to legally purchase non-UK grain and practically bought up most of the cheap maize, corn, that was being brought in from France. Good for the Scottish whiskey industry, not so good for the hungry Irish. So left them with very little. So didn't really work out. But Scottish whiskey distillers now, they had already begun using a different, more efficient type of still for whiskey production. The still was called the column still. And this was a design that the Irish didn't like at all. So they wouldn't use it. That type of still allowed for continuous distillation, and it drove production costs way down. I mean, way down. It also meant that using cheap maize, which I just talked about, that they were able to now get from France, combining that with corn grain, and then blending in with malt whiskey, really became a much cheaper method of production for Scottish whiskey distillers. And that alone caused those Irish distillers to lose some competitive advantage there. Now, interestingly enough, what the Scottish were doing, the taste profile that came out of that mix of French corn and mixing it with, Scottish malt, that taste was not as intense as the Irish pot still whiskey that was being produced at the time. And it turns out it found a home with a lot of Britain's consumers. They started to prefer that taste to what Irish whiskey tasted like before. So those things there, that was kind of the start of the decline of Irish whiskey. Then the early 20th century happened. And in the early 20th century, we saw two major events that really directly affected Irish whiskey production. In 1919, the United States of America introduced Prohibition, which abruptly put an end to a very lucrative export market for Irish whiskey distillers. Interestingly enough, a little sidebar, despite the laws around U.S. Prohibition, the Scottish distillers, they became very adept at smuggling their own whiskey into the States. They used routes through the Bahamas and through Canada to get their whiskey smuggled into the U.S., into that market. The Irish, though, for whatever reason, they proved to not be very good at doing that. They kind of missed out. Another little kind of interesting tidbit, funny enough, the once seemingly proud Irish-American Joe Kennedy, who was apparently an illegal, and I say apparently, illegal importer of Scotch whiskey. So, wasn't helping out the Irish there. Chose to go the Scottish route. And then to add further insult to injury, in the U.S., there was a lot of inferior or poorly produced illegal whiskey that was either being made illegally in the U.S., so moonshine, as an example, or it was poor quality whiskey that was smuggled in, likely from Scotland. And what they did was they put a label on there that said Irish whiskey. Now, this was probably done to try and boost the price that they could charge for the whiskey, because again, before all of this was happening, again, Irish whiskey was king of the hill. People were paying a premium for it. So they threw the name Irish whiskey on these lousy bottles of poorly produced whiskey. And all that really did was change people's perceptions of what Irish whiskey had become. The people that had bought the product now thinking it was the same high quality product they had known before, now started to think Irish whiskey, whatever they've done, it's terrible now. I don't like it. I'm not buying it. And sales dropped big time, on top of all the other challenges they were having. So now this was tough enough on Irish distillers. And although most of the bigger distilleries in Ireland were confident they could ride out this storm, and then they were also, of course, hoping that they would ride the storm out and that they would be able to cash in on pent-up demand once U.S. Prohibition ended, whenever that would be. 1921 rolled around. And now, with 1921, the Ireland Free State was created. Some of you may be wondering, why would Ireland being a free state hurt Irish whiskey producers? Well, the Irish Free State, when it was founded, it found that Catholics were predominantly in charge of Ireland. And that really wasn't good news for whiskey distillers for two reasons. Number one, Catholics in Ireland way back then largely felt that the distillation of whiskey was a Anglo-Irish activity, and that it really wasn't a pure Irish activity, that there was a lot of, Anglo and British influence in there. So they said, we're not going to support this. We're not going to support the industry. So strike one. The second thing that happened, perhaps more importantly, the Catholics back then, well, they were pretty hardcore and pretty much against drinking, period. So there was going to be no government help or support for anyone distilling anything. But of course, whiskey was the big product being produced in Ireland at the time. So those distillers, they found they had no friends in the new government. Both of these things tied into a trade war with Britain that had resulted in whiskey exports to Britain being cut off. With the Free State now, there was a trade war, so they couldn't export to Britain. And not only could they not export to Britain, kind of mainland around Ireland, it also meant that they couldn't export to any of the UK Commonwealth countries. These countries, of course, were Ireland's biggest whiskey export markets at the time. Another kick in the backside to the remaining Irish whiskey distillers. A lot of them started to close up when all this was happening. So they got punted in the behind again in 1936 when Spain joined the European Common. You see, when Spain joined, they then banned sherry casks from being exported to any other markets. Sherry casks at the time, and to a large degree still to this day, are the casks that Irish distillers like to use and have relied on for years and years and years to mature their whiskeys. And it kind of, that's what gave Irish whiskey some of its profile and its unique aspects. Flavors and all that jazz that people liked. So now they couldn't use this. So they had to use other things, other types of wood barrels, and largely the consumers that were still interested in Irish whiskey, they didn't like the new taste that they produced. So all of these aspects over those years produced huge declines in demand and sales, forced more and more of the distilleries to close. And by the 1950s, it was becoming increasingly clear that things in Ireland for Irish distillers really had to change. There were three big Irish families that were spending a ton of money on essentially beating each other up on the domestic market. They were spending the time and their money trying to promote each other and to promote their own brand and to take each other out. And in doing so, they each found that they had very little money, if any money at all, left to spend on exporting their whiskey. Right? And export markets were important. And they started to realize that, and they started to then look at things a little different, because exports were where they all kind of came around and said, that's where we have to be. By 1966, less than 1% of Irish whiskey distillers remained. And that prompted John Powers to do something drastic and very different. Very secretly and very discreetly, John Powers approached both Jameson and Cork distilleries about joining forces. After many secret meetings and some very, let's say, intense discussions, the three decided that it was in everyone's best interest to put Ireland first and to merge together. They created the entity Irish Distillers Limited. The reaction to the merger was was a pretty big shock to the industry as a whole, but it had a lot of support, especially in Ireland. Bushmills, who we talked about last week, they remained the lone distillery up in the north of Ireland and continued to operate independently beyond this merger. They said, no, we're going to do our own thing. However, declines kept happening, markets kept falling, and by 1973, they too merged with Irish Distillers Limited. Although part of the deal was they would continue to distill at their own distillery in the north and be separate from the production aspects going on in the Republic. In 1975, whiskey production for Irish Distillers Limited was moved out of Dublin, where Powers and Jameson and Cork and all those distillers were being produced. They were moved out of their independent facilities in Dublin in 1975, and they went to a brand new facility in Cork, Ireland, the Middleton Distillery, which, once it was finished, was touted as being the most advanced distillery in all of Europe. And with the move to Middleton, to that new distillery, it was jointly decided and agreed that Jameson would be the brand that IDL, Irish Distributors Limited, would get behind collectively to push as an international export. So 1975. And for those of you that have followed along from episode 1 of Whiskey on a Sunday, you know how that turned out for Jameson. It turned out very well. And for more information on that, please refer to episode 1 to learn more about Jameson. So that's the decline of Irish whiskey. I mean, fortunes, thankfully, have since changed for Irish whiskey globally. It's now estimated that Middleton produces over 60 million liters of whiskey per year, with Suntory Beam, and they own Cooley and the brands Kilbeggan, right? They're another big powerhouse globally. You know, in Ireland, they're estimated to produce about 3.9 million liters of whiskey a year, and Cuervo, who we talked about last week, owns Bushmills. You know, they're coming in around 3.6 million liters a year. You know, then we have all the smaller but still equally tasty and growing number of whiskey producers in Ireland. So the future is indeed looking bright as Irish whiskey again starts to cement itself, you know, with a global resurgence. And all that said, modern day whiskey aficionados still think to this day that it all ties back to that 1966 family merger. And had those three not gotten together and agreed to form one new company collectively, that very likely Irish whiskey as we know it today would not exist. So there you have it. Now you know how Irish whiskey went from king of the hill in the late 1800s all the way to near extinction by the mid-1960s. Talk about a wild ride. Thankfully, Irish whiskey has indeed seen an almost rebirth over the last 35 years, with the last 6 really seeing the segment grow by leaps and bounds. You know, new distilleries continue to emerge, several a year almost, you know, with some of them resurrecting long ago iconic brands. We saw that in episode 2 with what Ecklandville Distillery has done with the Dunville's name. And then some of these newer distilleries are not resurrecting iconic brands, but they're choosing to use names from Irish history. This week, thanks to the very kind folks at Cork Wines and Whiskies here in Ontario, I'm lucky to be able to show you guys what Powerscourt Distillery of Enniskerry, County Wicklow, has done with Fercullen. First, before we talk about the Fercullen, let's chat quickly about the distillery itself, Powerscourt. Now, Powerscourt's located in a former mill house on the 120-acre estate, the Powerscourt Estate, again in Enniskerry, County Wicklow. And the distillery itself began in 2016 as a joint venture between 2 entrepreneurs, Jerry Ginty and Ashley Gardner, as well as the Slazenger family who purchased that Powerscourt Estate property back in 1961. The property itself, the land itself, dates back as far as the 13th century and at one time even boasted a castle. It was originally owned by a man named Lepore, whose name eventually became anglicized and turned into Power, Lepore to Power, yeah, kind of see it. In the 17th century, the castle was remodeled and turned into a modern country home. So when you see it now, if you go to visit, you're not really going to see a castle. Currently, the estate still has 120 acres, and on that, they're growing premium barley to feed the distillery. And that all keeps in connection and in consult with their field-to-glass model that Powerscourt works under. And they use that model as a means to ensure authenticity and premium taste in, you know, what I'm going to call their pursuit to produce the ultimate Irish whiskey. We're going to hear those terms a lot, field to glass, grain to glass. We're going to see that more and more and more throughout the Whiskey on a Sunday series. But Powerscourt, you know, they're certainly adopting that model as well. Now, the water source is something special as well. The distillery draws its water from an underground river that contains certified mineral water and is said to be some of the most purest water in all of County Wicklow. So, you know, it's pretty good. You know, so pure mineral water, estate-grown barley. They even have customized stills at Powerscourt. But for me, I think the most important component of the distillery lies in who their master distiller is. The renowned and revered Noel Sweeney. Now, I realize some of you may not be familiar with, with the name Noel Sweeney, but I'm willing to bet that you're at least familiar with some of his whiskeys that he's had a hand in over the years. Brands like Tyrconnell, Connemara, Kilbeggan. These are just a few of the whiskey names that were distilled under Mr. Sweeney's watchful eye and careful hand during his time at Fercullen Distillery between 1989 and 2016. Mr. Sweeney is an Irish whiskey legend with almost 40 years of whiskey experience. He's always passionately and patiently been learning from former master distillers, all the while crafting his own styles. In 2017, Mr. Sweeney was inducted into the World Whiskey Hall of Fame, and most recently, in November of this year, November 2020, Mr. Sweeney was among 6 recipients of the Chairman's Award, being recognized for his contributions to the Irish whiskey world. One of my favorite Noel Sweeney quotes that I've come across says this, or Mr. Sweeney himself says this: "One thing about Irish whiskey is that you can only make it in Ireland. Great climate, great cereal, and great people." Mr. Sweeney, if you're watching, I could not agree with you more. Well said. Okay, now on to our 3 whiskeys tonight. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Powerscourt Estate and Distillery is located in Enniskerry, County Wicklow, just in the backdrop of the Sugarloaf Mountain. Now, this area long ago was the site to the Townland people, which bore the ancient Gaelic name Fercullen, which in today's English translates into Men of the Wicklow Hills. So use of that name, of that term, Fercullen, is thought to have disappeared with the Norman invasion of Ireland dating back to the 1300s. So with all of this in mind, it then makes perfect sense to me that the first whiskey release from Powerscourt was chosen to be named Fercullen, kind of a more modern take on Fercullen. So they used stocks from Cooley initially, because new distillery, not much choice there. So they used these stocks, and these stocks were stocks that Noel somehow seemed to manage to bring with him when he moved from Cooley to Powerscourt. So yay him, yay us. And that means then that, more importantly, that these whiskeys, regardless of whether Powerscourt is using Cooley stock, these whiskeys here are 100% Noel Sweeney whiskeys. So, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. For tasting, you may wonder what I'm up to, so I'm going to be very upfront. I'm going to follow the advice of Powerscourt's managing director, Alex Pearce, and I'm going to start with the Fercullen 10. So the 3 whiskeys I have is I have a premium blend, I have a Fercullen 10-year-old, and a Fercullen 14-year-old. Alex Pearce says, for Fercullen, you should start in the middle. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take my Fercullen 10, open her up, pour a little bit. I'm going to save a little bit. I'm going to tell you why in a little bit why I'm doing it too. So Fercullen 10, it's a single grain Irish whiskey. Single grain, that means it's a grain whiskey that's come from only one distillery. And in this case, the youngest whiskey that's being used in the distillation is 10 years old. It's at least 10 years old. So that's the youngest. So when you see a number on a bottle, that doesn't mean that everything in there is that age. It means that the youngest whiskey component in there is that age. So minimum 10 years old. In this whiskey, there's a high percentage of maize, corn, essentially, along with malted barley. Now, the exact percentage, that's a secret. There are some out there that think the ratio could be as high as 90% corn and only 10% malted barley. Alex Pearce himself has gone on record to admit that the maize content is very significant, but that's all he's given us. And that's totally fair. For me, that's all part of the fun and the mystery of Irish whiskey. So 40% alcohol by volume, matured in ex-bourbon casks, and I'd say that's on the lighter side of it's a gold, but it's not a deep gold. There's a bit of lightness in there. Gold-ish color. On the nose. So on the nose, right away I'm getting a lemon, lime, citrus zest, and vanilla. Those jump out right away. Then I'm getting some soft yellow apple, some candied orange peel, some honey, some white peach, some mango, interesting, and buttercream. There's definitely a creamy butterness in there. Almonds, sweet spice, like nutmeg, corn syrup, and then I'm getting some oak and some cedar. Also a bit of a bourbon-esque type note to it, which makes sense, former bourbon casks. Very, very interesting nose. Okay, going for a taste. Smooth. Touch sweet, but smooth. Crisp grain, ripe apple, there's pear, peach, honey, some cinnamon, I'm getting a little clove, vanilla bean pod, oak, and sandalwood. And there's a little, just at the back, there's a little white chocolate in there as well. The mouth feel is luscious and juicy. And now the finish, I'm getting candied pear and a bit of white pepper. All of those aromas and flavors, though, extremely well balanced in my opinion. I find it very nice. I find it very nice. Okay, so that's the Fercullen 10. This one can be a little tough to find. Ontario and Quebec, no luck for us folks here. There's none available. But I have seen some listings in British Columbia, so if there's anybody from Western Canada, I've heard rumors that there's some in Alberta, but I have seen online that there is some in BC. And I've seen in the US, from my US friends, that it's on several websites for whiskey retailing websites in the States. In BC, I found bottles at $78 Canadian, and in the US, I've seen it for $72 US. Fercullen 10. Okay, next up, I'm going to move on to the 14. And I'm doing that on purpose. For my palate, I find that older whiskeys tend to have more delicate and softer aromas and flavors. And I normally like to start with the older ones and move backwards. Again, I find, and I'm just talking myself, but I find when I start with younger whiskeys and try to move up the age range, I find that my palate can sometimes get overpowered and get tired. And then I find that it's tougher to pick out some of those softer nuances, and I may miss some great aspects of the older whiskeys. So that's how I approach it. I mean, take your own approach, of course, whatever works for you, but that's why I'm kind of bouncing around. And then, of course, when the managing director says start with the 10, I'm going to heed his advice. So the 14, double distilled single malt. So double distilled, folks. Proof that, as I said in episode 1, Irish whiskey, although largely is triple distilled, and that's typically a unique characteristic of Irish whiskey, you don't have to. It's not part of the laws. So double distilled. The youngest age of the whiskeys in here is, youngest is 14. Again, aged in ex-bourbon casks, and this one's bottled at 46%, so a little more robust on the alcohol content than our 10. Nice goldy color as well. On the nose. Malty right away. So just, malted barley right away. Ripe lemon, sweet orange, an almost tropical note like the juice from a grilled pineapple. And I know that's geeking out a bit, but there's a difference between the juice. The juice tends to be a little more sweeter, I find, than the actual grilled pineapple. So there's that juice from a grilled pineapple. And then I get this it reminds me of banoffee, which is a dessert in Ireland and the UK, where it's bananas, that's like a custardy type of banana with rum and graham cracker crust, and that's all in here, and I definitely pick out graham cracker crust, which is interesting. I'm also getting a meringue note. And then baking spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, brown sugar, some oak. And at the back end, just a little bit of salty mineral. So, wow, a lot going on in that glass. Okay, on the palate. A touch spicy, just on the tip of the tongue, but overall, very smooth, very soft. Some white pepper, a little zippy, but some white pepper there. Ripe orange now, cereal, ripe melon, cooked banana, so like a grilled banana, grilled apple, woody sandalwood, mineral salt, so just that salty minerality, and light notes of nutmeg and pepper. It's got a long finish. I mean, I'm talking, and I can, I can keep tasting this whiskey. Citrus, apple, a little bit of almost char or charcoal. Like, I wouldn't say as bitter as char, but there's almost a charcoal note in there. Yes, folks, I like this one quite a bit. Doesn't mean you will. I like it, but that's not a guarantee that you will. This one, good news, is available in Ontario. So all you Ontario folks, Cork Wines and Whiskies has it on their website. $154.60 Canadian. I've also seen the Fercullen 14 listed on US sites, whiskey sites, retailing for around $112 US per bottle. And these bottles, by the way, folks, are 700 milliliters. So not 750, they're 700s. Alrighty. Our Fercullen trifecta wraps up with the Fercullen Premium Blend. Again, double distilled. This is a blend of both malt and grain whiskeys. Regarding the grain whiskey, no grain whiskey in this batch is less than 7 years old, while on the malt side, there's no malt whiskey in here that is less than 10 years old. Aged in bourbon barrels and bottled at 40% alcohol by volume. Let's give it a nose, shall we? Take one more sniff there. So truthfully, it's a little tight. And when I say that, I mean it's not overly expressive. Certainly not as expressive as the other two. So we got to dig a little. There is citrus in there, so I'm getting lemon, orange, a little grapefruit. It's a little floral, something almost like a wildflower honey. Honey with some floral notes. Almond, hazelnut, candied orange peel. Definitely getting vanilla. I'm also getting some soft spice and a slight whiff of smoke, followed by a butterscotch note and cardamom. So, again, fair amount going on. Even though it's tight, there's a fair amount going on there. Interesting. So what's it taste like? Well, cheers. Smooth and crisp. Cereal grain, or a maltiness to it. Orange, pear, tangerine. A bit of a sweet grilled corn kind of note, and then vanilla. Also picking up some cedar notes and just a dusting of cinnamon. Finish on this is pretty good. I'd say it's medium plus. I wouldn't say it's long, but it's getting there. Vanilla, oak, that's sticking with me. So in Ontario, Cork Wines and Whiskies has this guy listed at $50.22 Canadian. And for my US friends, I have seen this listed on some sites again, different sites, and the average is about $54 USD. So there you have it. 3, in my opinion, tasty Fercullen Irish whiskies from Powerscourt. I admit, fully, I enjoyed all 3, although each had different profiles. But more importantly for me, I found the balance and the integration of the flavors in these whiskeys is just expertly done. And in my opinion, that's a further testament to why Mr. Sweeney is a whiskey Hall of Famer. I mean, just everything just flows so well into each other, and everybody gets along really nicely in the bottle. Now, the elephant in the room. Let's be honest, none of these whiskeys is cheap. You know, they all cost real money. However, I hope everyone watching, or anyone watching, keeps a few things in mind with regards to not only these 3 whiskeys, but to whiskeys that have age statements on them in general. Folks, time costs money. The longer a whiskey sits in a barrel, the longer whoever made it, the distiller, the blender, etc., the longer they have to wait before they see any monetary return on the product. You know, again, according to Powerscourt, no whiskey used in any of these 3 is younger than 7 years old, and that was only in the blend, the premium blend. The others had 10, 14, and up. So when we compare that to the Jamesons and the Bushmills that I've previously tasted, that are 3 years old, maybe 4 years old, certainly no more than 5, you can hopefully see why the Bushmills and the Jamesons are priced on the lower end versus whiskeys that are priced higher that have 7, 10, and 14 years of aging. Some other factors to keep in mind with regards to pricing. Volume's a good one. These Fercullen releases were limited runs. They're the first releases from a brand new distillery, limited runs, maybe 5,000 to 7,000 bottles of each produced. Bottles, not cases, bottles. That's nowhere near the hundreds of thousands of gallons, if not millions of gallons, that some of the more industrial, large-scale producers make. Let's also not forget the craftsmanship. I mean, again, we've got someone with 40 years of experience. And truthfully and rightfully so, that's going to demand a premium price point. Lastly, for Fercullen, these are first releases. I just said that before. Undoubtedly, these are going to be collector's items, and they're also then going to be hard to find. We already know that we can't get the 10 here in Ontario and Quebec, and so scarcity of supply is going to affect price to a degree. And I'm not just talking Fercullen here. All this applies to all whiskeys with age, or whiskeys that have limited runs, or who is at the helm, or a combination of all 3, who the master blender is, and age statements and quantity, etc. So just some things to keep in mind with regards to price. The last thing I'm going to say about price is there's no guarantee that an expensive whiskey is going to be to your liking. So we have to keep that in mind as well, right? Whiskey is very subjective. So I like the Fercullen 14. I think $154 Canadian for this quality of whiskey, and given everything, I think it's fair. And I like it, but it doesn't mean that if you bought it, you would. So you have to keep it all in mind. I mean, you like what you like at the end of the day, price aside, but I'm hoping you understand a little as to why things are priced the way they are. Okay, so now I would like to thank Cork Wines and Whiskey Limited for providing me with these 3 samples of Fercullen Irish Whiskey. So located in, I'm going to move this, I'm getting told by my EP, located in Ontario, Cork Wines and Whiskies are importers of award-winning fine wines, whiskeys, spirits, and beers from around the world. For my Ontario viewers, follow the bouncing finger. You can check out their full lineup and product offerings by visiting www.corkwinesandwhiskies.ca. And a reminder, folks, Whiskies in the website name is spelled WHISKEYS. So www.corkwinesandwhiskies.ca. You can also easily place product orders directly with them via the website and reach out to them with any questions you have. I'm sure the team there will be very happy to to answer any of your questions. A quick reminder as well, there's still time to book your own private virtual guided tasting by me, Somm for All, for whiskey, for wine, for beer, other spirits, or sake. So for more information on booking your holiday session or for booking your holiday gift, if you want to do that, you want to gift something like that to someone, drop me an email, paul@sommforall.com. And the number 4 is in the email address. So paul@somm4all.com, paul@sommforall.com. There we go. I'm going to go right to the 10. So folks, thank you for joining me here tonight. I really appreciate your time, whether you are watching this live or whether you are watching this on the replay. I appreciate you taking some of your Sunday evening to spend with me. Hopefully you're enjoying the sessions. Hopefully you're picking up some great tips, and hopefully you're encouraged to try some different whiskeys. Until next week, please be safe, please be well, and Slán from Somm for All.